I never believed in creatures like Bigfoot, until the day I found a massive dead body deep in the forests of northern Montana. What I discovered beside it was connected to a missing hiker, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. And the most disturbing part? Someone already knew these creatures existed, long before I ever found that body. Let me start from the beginning, because this story needs to be told exactly as it happened. My name is Ethan Carter, and before October of last year, I would have told you I understood the wilderness of northern Montana better than I understood most people. I would have been wrong. The morning it all started was the kind of morning that makes you forget the world has any sharp edges. I was sitting at the wooden table in my field cabin outside of Kalispell, drinking black coffee from a dented tin cup and watching frost melt off the window pane in slow, crooked lines. The cabin sat at the end of a Forest Service road that most maps didn't bother to name, surrounded on three sides by dense Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that climbed so thick up the mountain slopes they looked almost black in the early light. A pair of gray jays were arguing in the birch tree near the woodpile. The river, a small tributary of the Flathead that I'd never heard anyone else call by a name, muttered steadily somewhere below the ridge. It was mid-October. The aspens had mostly gone gold and bare. The air tasted like cold iron and pine resin, and there was enough silence in it that you could hear your own heartbeat if you listened. I had been sent to this particular stretch of the Whitefish Range by the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks to investigate a series of reported wolf depredations. 3 ranchers in the Swan Valley had lost livestock over the previous 6 weeks, and the descriptions of the kills didn't sit right with the regional biologist who reviewed the field reports. The carcasses had been left largely uneaten, which wasn't consistent with a wolf pack operating out of hunger. The wounds were concentrated around the upper back and neck, which was consistent with large canid behavior. But there were other marks, wider and less clean, that didn't match any wolf bite pattern in the database. My job was to go out, read the land, find the tracks, identify the pack if one existed, and determine whether lethal removal was warranted, or whether the kills could be attributed to something else entirely. Standard work for me. The kind of assignment I'd done 100 times. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup in the basin, and started checking my gear for the day. I laid everything out on the table the way I always do, making a mental inventory. My pack held 3 days of food, a water filtration system, an emergency bivouac sack, my first aid kit, a compass and topo maps of the drainage I was heading into, 2 spare batteries for my GPS unit, a recording device for field notes, sample collection bags, and my camera. On my belt, I carried a fixed-blade knife and my radio, though I knew from experience that the radio would be decorative for most of the next 3 days. The mountains in this part of the Whitefish Range ate radio signals like they ate snow, quietly and completely. I also carried a .44 Magnum revolver in a chest holster, not because I was afraid of wolves, because this was bear country, and the bears were still moving heavily before denning season. I pulled on my wool base layer, my insulated jacket, my gaiters, and my boots. I shouldered the pack, felt the familiar weight of it settle across my hips, and stepped outside into a morning so still it felt almost sacred. The frost crunched under my boots. My breath came out in long white plumes. The jays stopped arguing and watched me go. The trailhead I was working from wasn't really a trailhead. It was a place where the logging road ended in a tangle of blowdown, and the forest simply began, unmarked and unmanaged, rising into country that felt genuinely remote in a way that very few places in the lower 48 still managed. I'd worked in this drainage twice before, years ago, and I remembered it as a difficult place to navigate. full of deadfall and creek crossings, and terrain that looked straightforward on a map and turned out to be anything but. I remembered also that it was extraordinary country. Old growth stands where the trees were 4 and 5 feet across, and the canopy was so dense that almost no undergrowth survived beneath them, only deep moss and silence, and a kind of filtered green light that felt like being underwater. I had always liked this drainage. I made good progress through the first 2 miles. The ground was soft enough to hold prints, and I found what I was looking for within the first hour: wolf tracks in the mud along a small creek. 2 animals by the size of the spread, moving northeast. The prints were large, consistent with the northern Rocky Mountain wolf subspecies that had been reintroduced to this region. I photographed them, measured the stride length, noted the direction of travel, and kept moving. The morning warmed slightly as the sun crested the ridgeline to the east and cut through the trees in long, diagonal shafts. The frost retreated from the ground. The jays reappeared, following me at a distance the way they sometimes do in remote country, curious about anything that moves. By noon, I was deep enough into the drainage that the logging road behind me felt like a memory from a different world. I stopped at a flat rock above a creek to eat lunch, sitting with my back to a big fir and my eyes moving over the forest across the water. I was thinking about the kill patterns, running through the inconsistencies, when I noticed something that pulled me out of my thoughts. On the far bank, about 30 yards up from where I was sitting, the vegetation had been disturbed in a way that wasn't consistent with deer or elk. The ferns were flattened in a wide, irregular pattern, and several of the lower branches of a young spruce had been broken off cleanly at a height of roughly 7 feet. I studied it for a long moment without moving. Then I got up, crossed the creek on a series of flat stones, and walked up to examine it more closely. The branch breaks were recent. The wood at the breaks was pale and clean, not yet oxidized. Whatever had done it within the last day or 2. The flattened ferns covered an area maybe 12 feet across, and in the center of that area, pressed into a patch of soft mud near the creek bank, I found a partial print. I crouched over it and felt the fine hairs on the back of my neck rise before my conscious mind had fully processed what I was looking at. It was a footprint, large, 5-toed, with a structure that was distinctly bipedal. The heel impression was deep and wide. The toe spread was significant. I measured it with the ruler on my knife sheath. 14 inches long, 8 inches across at the widest point. The depth of the impression suggested a weight I didn't want to think about. I stayed crouched over that print for a long time, not moving, listening to the creek and the wind and the sound of my own breathing. Then I straightened up, looked at the forest around me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt genuinely uncertain about what kind of country I was standing in. I didn't sleep well that night. I had made camp in a small clearing about 2 miles further into the drainage, at a bend in the creek where a line of old cottonwoods gave some shelter from the wind. I ate, cataloged my field notes, took a precise GPS reading of the print location, and climbed into my sleeping bag well before dark. But sleep wouldn't come in anything but fragments. The forest around the tent was alive with the usual sounds: the creek, the wind working through the high branches, the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere on a dead snag. Normal sounds. And yet I lay awake listening to them with an alertness I couldn't turn off. My body convinced of something my mind was still resisting. In the morning, I went back to the print. I had told myself overnight that I'd overestimated the size, that the mud had distorted the impression. that there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Standing over it again, in the gray, early light, I could not make myself believe any of those things. The print was exactly what I had measured it to be, and there was a second one I had missed in the fading afternoon light, pressed into the soft soil at the base of the spruce. 2 prints, same size, the right amount of distance between them for a bipedal stride of something very large. I began working the surrounding area more systematically, expanding my search radius in careful concentric arcs from the print site. An hour into it, I found the trail. It came down from the north, from the steeper country above the creek, and it moved through the drainage in long, unhurried strides that told me whatever had made it was covering ground efficiently and without apparent stress. I followed it downstream for nearly half a mile before losing it on a long stretch of exposed rock. What I found along that half mile stayed with me. The branch breaks continued at consistent intervals, always between 6 and 8 feet off the ground. In 3 separate locations, bark had been stripped from the lower portion of large fir trunks in a pattern I'd never seen from any animal I'd studied. The strips were wide, torn rather than gnawed, requiring both significant force and something like fingers to accomplish. At one point the trail crossed a muddy seep, and there I found 4 prints in a row, clear and complete, and the stride length measured at 52 inches. I photographed every one of them. I kept thinking about the livestock kills, the marks that hadn't matched wolf bites, the carcasses left largely uneaten. I thought about the height of the branch breaks. I thought about what animal in northern Montana moved bipedally, stripped bark, and left 14-inch prints. And then I stopped following that line of thinking, because it led somewhere I wasn't ready to go. I spent the rest of that second day working the drainage for wolf sign, and found plenty of it. The 2 wolves I'd been tracking were using a series of travel corridors along the creek, and I located 2 probable bedding sites on south-facing slopes above the tree line. Normal behavior, normal animals. I documented everything. In the back of my mind, behind the professional observation and the methodical fieldwork, the other thing sat like a stone. On the morning of the 3rd day, I found the smell. It came to me from the west, carried on a wind that moved down off the ridge in the hour before dawn while I was breaking camp. It was the smell of decomposition, deep and organic, and unmistakable to anyone who has spent time in wild country. But layered underneath it was something else, something I didn't have a name for, a heavy musk that wasn't quite like anything I had encountered before. Not bear, not elk, not any predator I knew. I followed it. The terrain climbed steeply away from the creek bottom, forcing me up through a tangle of downfall and dense young fir that grabbed at my pack and my jacket. I moved slowly, watching the ground. The smell strengthened as I climbed. After about 300 yards, I emerged into a pocket of old growth, a stand of ancient spruce and cedar, where the canopy was complete enough that the forest floor was open and mossy, dim even in mid-morning, the light coming down in narrow, pale columns through the upper branches. In the center of that pocket, lying against the base of a massive cedar with a trunk wider than my arm span, was the body. I stopped at the edge of the old growth and stood very still for a long moment, taking in what I was seeing. My first thought was bear. The mass was consistent with a large bear, but the shape was wrong, and as my eyes adjusted to the dim light and I understood what I was looking at, my heart began to move in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. It was a primate, not a bear, not any animal I had a name for. It was massive, lying on its side with its back against the cedar, its long arms folded across its chest, in a posture that was disturbingly, uncomfortably human. The body was covered in coarse, dark hair, brown and black, with patches where the hair had thinned and the dark skin beneath was visible. The face was partially visible from where I stood, and I could see a broad, flat nose, a heavy brow ridge, and a jaw of extraordinary size. I could see the hands, long-fingered and enormous, curled against its chest. I could see the feet, 14 inches minimum. I stood at the edge of that old-growth stand for a very long time before I moved. The body had been there for perhaps 10 days to 2 weeks, based on the state of decomposition. There were no obvious external wounds, no sign of violence from another animal. But there was something wrong with the lower abdomen, a swelling that didn't look like normal bloat from decomposition gases. It was irregular, asymmetrical, concentrated on the left side. I had spent 23 years in the field. I had field-dressed more animals than I could count. I knew what a body was supposed to look like at various stages of decomposition, and what I was looking at in that lower abdomen was not normal. I took photographs, many photographs. I took GPS coordinates, noted every detail in my voice recorder, marked the surrounding trees with surveyor's tape from my pack. I spent 2 hours documenting the scene before I let myself think about what I was going to do next. And then I remembered the missing woman, Emily Harper, 28, from Missoula. She had posted on her hiking blog 6 weeks earlier about a solo traverse she was planning in the Whitefish Range, a route that would take her through exactly this drainage. Her last post had gone up on September 15th, a brief update from a trailhead saying she was heading in. She had never come out. Search and Rescue had spent 8 days looking for her and found nothing. The case was technically still open, but everyone who worked in this part of the state understood what open cases in this terrain usually meant. I looked at the swollen abdomen of the creature lying against the cedar, and then I did what I had to do. I will not describe in detail what I found inside that body. I will say only what is necessary, because some of what I discovered in the next 90 minutes under the pale, filtered light of that old-growth stand is something I have spent considerable effort since then learning to carry without being crushed by it. The hide was extraordinarily thick, far denser than any bear or large mammal I had worked with. It required significant force to penetrate with my knife. When I finally opened the abdominal cavity, the secondary odor that escaped was enough to make me step back and breathe through my mouth for nearly a minute before I could continue. What I found inside was not entirely the creature's own tissue. There was foreign material in the digestive tract. Synthetic fabric, the unmistakable bright orange of a modern hiking jacket, deteriorated but still identifiable. A fragment of what appeared to be nylon webbing from a pack strap, a piece of rubber consistent with a boot sole, and buried deeper in the lower portion of the stomach contents, something small and hard that caught the beam of my headlamp. I used the tip of my knife to draw it out and cleaned it in the creek water I carried in my bottle. It was a small device, rectangular, about the size of a thick business card. A GPS locator tag, the kind serious backcountry hikers attach to their packs as emergency beacons. The back of the device had a piece of adhesive tape on it, and on the tape, written in a neat hand with a permanent marker, were 2 words, Emily Harper. I sat back on my heels in the moss of that old-growth stand with that small device in my palm and felt the world rearrange itself around me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and irrevocably. The way a joint shifts when something tears inside it, a small movement with permanent consequences. I gathered what evidence I could, placing the GPS tag, the fabric fragments, and the boot rubber carefully into sample bags from my kit. I sealed the bags and labeled them in my field notebook. Then I sat beside the body of the creature for a long time, looking at it. It was not a monster. That was the first clear thought I was able to form, and it surprised me with its certainty. Whatever had happened here, whatever set of circumstances had led to this intersection of a creature's desperate hunger and a young woman's solitary adventure in wild country, the thing lying against the cedar tree was not a monster. It was an animal. A suffering animal, I was beginning to understand. I examined the creature's left leg more carefully and found what I had begun to suspect I would find. An old injury, a wound that had healed poorly and was consistent in both its shape and its scarring pattern with a large leg-hold trap. The kind that was illegal in Montana, but was still set illegally by individuals operating in remote backcountry, far from any warden's attention. The kind that I had personally documented and reported to enforcement twice in the last decade, and both times the perpetrators had received fines that amounted to a mild inconvenience. The wound had healed, after a fashion, but the tissue damage was extensive, and the gait mechanics of an animal of this size and weight, with this degree of injury to the musculature of the upper leg, would have been severely compromised. It would have been in chronic pain. It would have been limited in its ability to hunt and forage. It would have been, in the language of wildlife biology, a stressed animal operating under resource limitation. Stressed animals in resource limitation do things they would not otherwise do. Every wildlife professional in the world knows this. It is not an excuse. It is not a defense. It is simply a fact about how living things behave when survival becomes uncertain. I marked everything. I took the GPS coordinates 3 separate times to be sure. I marked a trail back to the access point with surveyor's tape every 20 yards. And then I began the long hike out to find cell service. It took 4 hours to reach the logging road, and another 40 minutes of driving before I got 2 bars on my phone. I pulled over and sat in my truck for a moment, with the phone in my hand and the engine running and the heater going and the forest standing dark and close on both sides of the road. Then I dialed the regional wildlife office. The call that came back to me 30 minutes later was not from the wildlife office. It was from a number I didn't recognize, with a 202 area code. The woman on the phone identified herself as Special Agent Diane Morse with the FBI's Wildlife Crime Unit, which I had been vaguely aware existed but had never had direct contact with. Her voice was measured and professional. She told me that my call to the regional office had been flagged and transferred, and that she needed me to tell her everything I had found, in order, without leaving anything out. I told her. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a pause that lasted long enough to make me uncomfortable. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I need you to return to the site tomorrow morning with a team we will send to meet you at your cabin. Do not discuss what you found with anyone before then. I mean anyone. Not your supervisor, not friends, not family. Do you understand what I'm asking?" I told her I did. "I also need you to understand," she said, "that what you've discovered has implications that go significantly beyond the immediate situation. There are people in several federal agencies who have been monitoring certain indicators in this region for a number of years. What you found today is something we have been preparing for. We will explain more tomorrow." I drove back to the cabin. I fed the fire. I sat at the wooden table where I had drunk my coffee that quiet morning that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, and tried to process what the day had contained. Outside the window, the forest was absolutely dark. No moon, the trees invisible against the sky, the river audible somewhere below the ridge in the darkness. I had worked in this country for more than 2 decades, and I had never once sat in that cabin and felt that the darkness outside was watching me. I felt it that night. The team arrived before dawn. 2 black SUVs navigated the logging road with the particular authority of vehicles that are never questioned. There were 5 people. Agent Morse, who was younger than she had sounded on the phone, with close-cropped dark hair and a manner that combined genuine intelligence with the specific kind of wariness that comes from working in classified environments. A forensic biologist from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service named Dr. Navarro, who said very little and took notes in a small green notebook with a mechanical pencil. 2 field agents whose names I was not given, and a man who was introduced simply as Dr. Whitmore, a senior research biologist from an institution he declined to specify, who was clearly the scientific lead of whatever operation this was. Dr. Whitmore was in his late 60s, with white hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent serious time in field environments. He shook my hand in the cabin doorway and looked at me with eyes that were measuring something more than my reliability as a guide. "You've been in wildlife management for 23 years, he said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. You've tracked large predators extensively, bears, cougars, wolves." "Yes." "And your first response to finding this animal was to collect evidence and mark the site rather than leave it or attempt to remove evidence." "It's what the work requires," I said. He nodded slowly. "Good. That's going to matter." I led them in. The hike took 3.5 hours at the pace of the full group, longer than I had made it alone, and the cold had come back down hard overnight, putting frost on every surface and making the creek crossings treacherous. No one spoke much. Dr. Whitmore walked beside me for the first hour and asked careful, specific questions about the print trail I had followed and the location of the injury I had found on the creature's leg. His questions were precise in a way that told me he already had a significant amount of knowledge about the subject and was filling in specific gaps rather than learning from scratch. When we reached the old-growth stand and he saw the body, he stopped at the edge of the trees and stood there for a long moment in the same way I had. Then he walked forward slowly and crouched beside it, and for a long time he simply looked. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "This is the 3rd confirmed fatality we've documented in this region in 4 years," he said. "All natural causes. All isolated individuals. None in circumstances like this." He paused. "The population in this drainage is small. We believe it's 6 to 9 individuals. The evidence you've gathered today is consistent with what we know about the behavior of injured animals within that population." I looked at him. "You've known they were here?" "For 11 years, he said. "We've had evidence of their presence in 6 separate drainages in the northern Rockies. Camera traps, eDNA samples, track casts. A body 3 years ago in Idaho, recovered before it could be found by anyone outside our team." He stood and looked at me directly. "Mr. Carter, what you found in this animal's stomach, the evidence connected to the missing woman, this is the first documented incident of this kind. The first confirmed human fatality attributable to this species. And we need to understand it completely, because how we handle the information in the next few weeks will determine whether these animals survive or whether we lose them." Dr. Navarro spent 4 hours working the scene. She was systematic and thorough, far more equipped than I had been, working with proper evidence collection tools and sample preservation equipment that maintained chain of custody for everything she touched. The GPS tag went into a sealed evidence container. The fabric fragments. Everything I had bagged was transferred to her custody. Agent Morse photographed every inch of the body and the surrounding site, working in careful grid patterns, documenting the scene with a precision that was impressive to watch. The 2 field agents swept the surrounding area and found what I had not had time to look for. 300 yards north, on a slope above the old-growth stand, they found a resting site, a depression in the moss and fern roughly 6 feet by 4 feet, where something very large had been lying for extended periods. The vegetation around it was pressed down in patterns suggesting repeated use over several weeks. Near the resting site, they found 2 more footprints and a scatter of pine cone fragments where something had been feeding. And about 100 yards further upslope, half buried in forest duff and almost completely invisible, they found the trap. A large leg-hold trap, illegal, set on a game trail. Old, rusted, no longer active, but unambiguously the source of the wound I had found on the creature's leg. Dr. Navarro photographed and documented it. I looked at it for a long time without speaking. The trap has been there at least 2 years based on oxidation, one of the field agents told Morse. Whoever set it didn't come back for it. I thought about an animal of that size and intelligence, built for a life of silent movement through deep forest, caught in that steel jaw. The pain of it, the terror. What it would do to an animal's relationship to its own body, to its ability to move and hunt and survive. What it would do, over months and years, to an animal's mind. As the afternoon light faded toward evening, Dr. Whitmore found me sitting on a log at the edge of the old-growth stand while the team finished their work. He sat down beside me, and for a while neither of us said anything. "What happens now?" I asked. "The forensic work here continues for 2 more days. The body will be transported to a secure facility for full necropsy. Emily Harper's family will be notified through official channels that her remains have been recovered in a wildlife-related incident. The public statement will describe a bear encounter." He paused. "And then we have a decision to make about you." I looked at him. "We need people in the field," he said. "People with your specific combination of skills and your specific relationship to this terrain. We've been running this program with a very small team. Too small. The population of these animals is under pressure, and not just from illegal trapping. There's a logging expansion proposal currently moving through the Forest Service approval process that would open 3 of the 6 drainages where we have confirmed presence. We need people who can work quietly, who understand the ecology, and who can advocate from inside the system for protections that don't require publicly explaining what we're protecting." He looked at me steadily. "I won't pretend this isn't asking a great deal of you. There are restrictions on what you can say and to whom. There are things you will know that you can never discuss. But the work is real, and the stakes are real, and frankly, Mr. Carter, after what happened to Emily Harper, I think you already understand that." I thought about the trap in the duff. I thought about the livestock kills, reported to me as wolf depredations, and what it meant that they had been misattributed. Whether deliberately or through genuine uncertainty, I wasn't sure yet. I thought about 6 to 9 animals living in the most remote country in the northern Rockies, aware of us in the way only wild things can be, aware of us and deliberately, consistently avoiding us, and what it meant that this single, isolated tragedy had happened, and what it would mean if it became the story people told about what these animals were. "I'll do it," I said. The months that followed changed the shape of my days completely. On paper, I was still working for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, still investigating wildlife incidents, still submitting field reports and attending regional meetings, and doing all the ordinary things my job required. But underneath that ordinary life, there was the other work. Dr. Whitmore's team, which I eventually came to know as the Northern Cordillera Biological Survey, operated out of a facility at Malmstrom Air Force Base that had originally been built for something else and been converted, quietly and without fanfare, into a fully equipped field research laboratory. There were 7 of us in total, working across the 6 drainages. I was the only one based in the Whitefish Range. The others were spread through the Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Cabinet Mountains, the Bitterroot Country along the Idaho border. We did not try to find the animals. We tried to understand where they were, and what they needed, and what was threatening them. And then we tried to remove the threats without drawing attention to the reasons. It was slow, indirect work that required patience of a kind I hadn't previously been asked to exercise. In the whitefish drainage where I worked, I documented what I eventually came to believe was a family group of 7 or 8 individuals. I never saw one clearly. I had glimpses, twice, at the edge of vision in heavy timber, of something large moving with a deliberate, unhurried stride that was unlike any animal I had previously observed. Once, at dusk, I heard a sound from above the tree line that I have never been able to adequately describe, a low, resonant vocalization that carried across the cold air of the drainage in a way that seemed to address the landscape itself. I sat still and listened to it for a long time after it faded. The trail cameras we installed, using Forest Service access that I arranged through channels I will not detail here, produced 42 confirmed images over the following year. None of them was clear enough to be useful as public evidence. All of them were more than enough for Dr. Whitmore's purposes. The animals were aware of the cameras. By the 3rd month, they were deliberately avoiding the locations where cameras had been placed, adjusting their movement routes, demonstrating a sophisticated spatial awareness that Dr. Navarro told me was consistent with what the team had observed in the other drainages. They were learning. They were adapting. They were, by every measure that mattered, doing everything possible to maintain the distance between themselves and the human world that had apparently kept them hidden for centuries. We removed 14 illegal traps from the drainage in the first 8 months. 14. Most of them old and inactive, some relatively recent. 2 of them showed evidence of having caught animals, not the large bipedal animals we were studying, but deer and bear and smaller mammals, suffering inflicted carelessly into a landscape that didn't belong to the people setting the traps, and that those people would never be held meaningfully accountable for. I reported each trap through the proper channels and gave enforcement the coordinates. The resulting investigations produced 3 citations and 2 nominal fines. In the spring, the logging proposal moved to the final comment period. It would open a corridor through the western edge of the Whitefish Range drainage, following a ridgeline that was directly adjacent to 2 of the movement corridors I had documented for the family group. Dr. Whitmore submitted technical comments through the biological survey, and I submitted comments in my own capacity as a regional wildlife specialist, citing habitat fragmentation concerns for ungulates and the documented wolf corridors. We did not cite the real reason. We could not cite the real reason. The proposal moved forward with minor modifications that did not address the corridors we were most concerned about. I spent a night in March sitting on a hillside above those corridors, watching the ridge in the thin moonlight, knowing that somewhere in the darkness below me, the family group was using those routes, had been using them likely for generations, and that by summer they would be severed by machinery and road construction and the ordinary industrial logic of resource extraction. I stayed on that hillside until the cold drove me down. I drove back to the cabin and sat at the table where I had drunk my coffee that quiet morning the previous October, and I wrote a long, detailed field report that I knew would go into a classified database and be read by people in offices far from these mountains, who would use it to inform policy decisions that I would never be consulted about. The necropsy results on the creature had come back in January. Dr. Navarro called me with the summary. The leg injury had resulted in chronic osteomyelitis, a bone infection that had been ongoing for at least 18 months, and that would have caused constant, severe pain. The animal had been significantly malnourished, its body weight well below what the team's models suggested was normal for a specimen of its skeletal size. Toxicology had found elevated levels of several compounds consistent with the consumption of processed food products, including preservatives and artificial additives that the animal's digestive system had been entirely unequipped to process. The stomach contents had been fully catalogued. The GPS tag, the fabric, a boot sole fragment, and tissue. I will not say more than that. Emily Harper's family received an official letter from the King County Sheriff's Department in November. Her remains had been recovered through forensic evidence in a remote area of the Flathead National Forest. The circumstances of her death were consistent with a wildlife encounter. The investigation was closed. The letter expressed condolences. Her mother called me. I don't know how she found my number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. She wanted to know what had happened to her daughter. She wanted to understand. She was not hysterical. She was a woman who had spent months in uncertainty and had decided that whatever the truth was, she could bear it better than the not knowing. She said Emily had hiked alone her whole life. She said Emily had known the risks and had chosen the life she had because the alternative, a safe life with the wilderness at a distance, was not living to her. She said she wasn't looking to blame anyone. She just needed to know. I told her that Emily had died in a wildlife encounter in remote country. I told her it had been fast. I told her the evidence suggested she had not suffered for long. I told her that the area where it happened was extraordinary, the kind of country her daughter had loved, that it was wild and ancient and real in a way that very few places still were. I told her that what happened was a tragedy that was not Emily's fault, and not the fault of the wilderness, and not the fault of any simple, assignable cause, but was instead the collision of a chain of events, including a serious act of illegal cruelty against an animal that had set conditions in motion that couldn't be undone. I told her as much of the truth as I was allowed to tell, and then I sat with what I couldn't tell her, and that weight has not gotten lighter. 18 months after that October morning, I received an email from Dr. Whitmore asking me to come to Malmstrom for a program review. I drove down on a Tuesday in April, through a landscape that was still patchy with late snow at elevation, the larch just starting to come green in the lower valleys. I had been to the facility 4 times before, always for specific operational purposes, never for anything described as a review. There were people in the room I hadn't met. A deputy director from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a senior policy advisor from the Department of the Interior, an attorney from the Department of Justice, whose role was not specified. Dr. Whitmore sat at the end of the table, and when I came in, he stood and shook my hand with both of his, which was not a thing he had done before. The meeting lasted 3 hours. What they told me, in the careful and precise language of people who understood liability and classification and the management of information, was this. The Northern Cordillera Biological Survey had been formally elevated to a permanent interagency program with dedicated funding. The 6 drainages where presence had been confirmed were being designated as a new category of protected zone under the existing framework of critical habitat designation, using endangered species language that would protect the habitat without requiring public disclosure of the specific species being protected. The logging proposal in the Whitefish Range had been withdrawn. Not modified, withdrawn. The corridor was preserved. And then the attorney told me that my employment status was being modified. My position with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks would continue as a matter of official record, but my actual work and direction of effort would be formally transferred to the survey, with a budget allocation that represented a significant increase from my current compensation. They were, in the language of the agreement they put in front of me, making me permanent. I sat with the agreement on the table in front of me and looked at it for a long time without picking it up. "The withdrawal of the logging proposal," I said. "How did that happen?" The deputy director from Fish and Wildlife looked at the attorney, who looked at Dr. Whitmore. "Pressure from multiple directions," Whitmore said, "including the comments you and I submitted. But not only that." A pause. "No, not only that. There are people in the Forest Service, in the relevant committees, who know what we know. There are people," Whitmore said carefully, "who have been provided with sufficient information to make certain decisions." I thought about that. I thought about the layers of it, the concentric rings of partial knowledge, the people who knew everything, and the people who knew enough, and the people who knew only what they needed to know to make the right call without understanding why it was right. I thought about Emily Harper's mother on the phone asking me for the truth. I thought about the 14 traps. I thought about an animal lying alone against a cedar tree in old-growth forest, having carried for 18 months a wound that should have been prevented. I thought about 6 to 9 individuals moving through dark drainages in the northern Rockies, adjusting their routes around trail cameras, demonstrating over and over their absolute preference for a world without us in it. Surviving, continuing, asking for nothing except to be left alone in the territory that had been theirs long before any of us arrived. I picked up the pen, and then I put it down. "I have a condition," I said. Whitmore didn't look surprised. "Tell me." "The trap enforcement. I've reported 14 illegal traps in this drainage in 18 months, and the total penalties assessed amount to less than $3,000. That's not enforcement. That's a process that exists to look like enforcement while changing nothing." I looked at the deputy director. "If I'm part of this program permanently, I need a real enforcement mechanism. Not just citations, prosecution, asset seizure. The same tools you use for wildlife trafficking. Because what happened to that animal, what that trap set in motion, cost a young woman her life, and it's going to keep costing people things they can't afford to lose as long as the actual punishment for illegal trapping in remote backcountry is a fine that nobody loses sleep over." The room was quiet. The deputy director wrote something on a notepad. "That's a policy change that goes beyond this program's authority to implement," he said. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to implement it today. I'm asking for a written commitment that it will be formally proposed through the appropriate channels within 6 months, with this program's active support as a condition of my participation going forward." I paused. "I'll sign your agreement. I'll do this work. I believe in the work. But I need to know that the mechanism that created this situation in the first place is being addressed, not just managed around." Another pause, longer this time. Dr. Whitmore was looking at me with the same measuring expression he had worn the first morning on the cabin doorstep. Then he looked at the deputy director. The deputy director wrote something further on his notepad. He folded it and passed it to the attorney. The attorney read it and nodded once. "We can commit to that in writing," the deputy director said. I picked up the pen and signed. I drove back north through the April landscape, through the patchy snow and the greening larch and the long light of a spring evening that lay gold and thin across the mountain valleys. I stopped once, at a pullout above the drainage where the whole thing had started, and sat in my truck and looked at the forest running up the slopes below the ridge. From here the trees were dense and undifferentiated, a dark, continuous surface broken only by the pale lines of creek drainages and the gray rock outcrops near the tree line. Nothing about it looked like a place that held anything extraordinary. Nothing about it gave away what lived inside it. 6 months later, the enforcement proposal was submitted. It moved through committee at the pace such things move, which is to say slowly and with no guarantee of outcome. I track it the way I track everything now, patiently, from a distance, noting movement and direction, and the small signs that tell you whether something is heading somewhere or just making noise. The written commitment sits in a file in my cabin, in a folder beside the field notebooks from those first days. Beside